intended to map the demographics of the occupied territories and thereby reinforce the restrictions and privileges which applied to each category. The system also served to warp the demographic data on the ground, as many indigenous people left their traditional villages and sought to be counted as mestizos to avoid tribute payments to the Spanish. And here we see the relationship between art and administration. The art and architecture of the Baroque period serves, as discussed, to signal closure for the Spanish, to delineate what anthropologist and economist David Graeber has described as the most brutal period of European colonial history, as a style. It is, to paraphrase David Riff in discussion of the Moscow Biennale, art as the appearance of legality. In the same way that the colonial administration of every conceivable racial intermingling attempted to control the perceived chaos of European and non-European racial and cultural polyphony, which is to say, a semblance of moral order. As I have attempted to demonstrate above, I believe that human culture can be meaningfully and productively analysed in relationship to other assemblages of form. It is clearly not that cultural concepts and ideas follow biological rules, but that the mechanisms that determine which ideas prevail and which are left to wither on the vine are analogous. The mestizo and other intermingled races within colonial South America, and indeed the racial and cultural polyphonies found in the wake of colonial and imperial violence the world over, are the product of migration, as we all are. Where the administration of race has come to conflict with civil liberties and human rights, I argue, European quote-unquote post-colonial nations demonstrate an unwillingness to facilitate full integration to migrants and refugees. This traditionally comes down to racism, but is increasingly articulated as the fear that their own cultural stock is not sufficiently robust, relevant or important enough to survive a process which occurs regularly in every other self-organizing organic structure, namely mutation. In this book, two forms of biological development have been brought into play. Neither will be offered as a miracle cure with which to forge a new and more equitable cultural plateau. Because culture is always drawn from the past, I do not believe culture is where the struggle for equity will be triumphant. Not that culture is not vital to the development of political, spiritual, and philosophical ideas. It's just that, as it seems to me, culture is there to be interpreted, not lived by. I'll try to explain what I mean by employing the biological examples of mutation and epigenetics, where mutation is being tied to novelty and plurality of expression, and epigenetic patterns are tied to the notion of administration. As discussed, epigenetic tags sit on top of an organism's genome, regulating the expression of genes in relationship to the environment and creating rhythmic cyclical patterns in the data. One could say that whole genres of creative production perform the task of regulating the culture reflecting the values of society back to itself, its biases, longings and worst nightmares, all bundled up and encoded for consumption. Catchy pop music, such as the 1989 B-52's hit single Love Shack, depicts a world post-sexual revolution in raucous detail, relieving me of my own desire which has the potential to give me a much better sense of my erotic relationships with the world, were it to be addressed head-on. In this way, culture often attempts to ameliorate the disappointments of life. Pop music is a good example of cultural epigenetics because it turns, with the times, almost to a beat. The prevalence of new media as it was once called, admits the fabricated artificiality of a cultural movement that relishes in being a simulacra of something else. Passion, realness, money, infinity, power, heaven, hell. We need pop music, and we need Baroque architecture, just as we have come to need all the other patterns which culture describes for us in order to make sense of the world around us. Patterns are our oxygen. I am dependent, despite myself. In this sense, cultural epigenetics is simply a means of creating a comparative anthropology of cultural change, except that it's actually all about stasis. The Baroque, in its lavish complexity, is really just a mutation on the neoclassical, one that became stuck, looping like a scratched CD of Meatloaf's 1974 single, Bat Out of Hell. It represents repetition and stasis both as a cultural bracket for the age, but also as a set of forms with their own internal logic. In this way, one can observe the porosity of culture as it imbibes the predominant values of the time, brackets Western universalism and the infinite, close brackets. And the work that this quote-unquote culture then performs on us, the viewer, further down the sense-making food chain. The purpose of culture is to create more culture, because only expansion satisfies the inherent logic of capitalist accumulation, set into motion with the dawn of colonialism. Just as the purpose of life is to create more life. Indeed, mutation gives me the possibility of life in the first place, for, brackets, as far as contemporary studies have shown, close brackets, only when the first amino acid-rich molecules of the ocean began to evolve could life as we know it begin. As Darwin discovered, mutation is the building block of biological evolution. Even though the definitive trigger for evolution may never be proven, it is accurate to say that the best hypothesis we have place mutation at the core of evolutionary process. In culture, in capitalism, and in biology, mutation makes new forms possible. To quote the Czech playwright, essayist and dissident Václav Havel, life is, after all, entropy in reverse. Epigenetic repetition demonstrates how life replicates itself in accordance with its environment. If the purpose of life is to create more life, patterns show me how, while mutation gives me the means. But if the artwork becomes an instrument of administration, the means to do what exactly? And if new mutations are only discernible to me after the event, am I not destined to succumb to the regulating, conserving, replicating force of whichever power my work comes to serve? Is it inevitable that art becomes administrative? Or is there something worse? And if architecture is the site where politics intervenes in our lives most regularly and most profoundly, which mutant architectural forms cohere with the early 21st century, following the symbolic breach of the United States Capitol by the viral infection of political extremism? Metabolism? Cultural epigenetics operates the way the chemical tags that influence our histones do, insofar as both serve to regulate and influence the cultural body. The mechanisms for doing this are often discrete, complex and difficult to discern within the moment of their convection across the landscape of human sense-making. The study of the Baroque as a form of cultural epigenetics reveals that while power is more than willing to explore new terrains for the extraction of resources, as the organic nature of capitalism demonstrates, brackets through the infinite creation of new markets, close brackets, holding the church or merchant expansionists to account is not part of this process. History may walk blindly into the future, but corporations do not. In this sense, the collections of museums and national archives create the impression of bourgeois order and rationale to which they owe their very reason for being. All art, to a greater or lesser extent, domesticates human thought and experience. Like language, it is obliged to. It can be used for good or bad, but it is surely better when, like the human individual, it seeks to be self-aware and honest about the contingent nature of its own history. Finally, as resurgent contemporary political movements in Bolivia demonstrate, there is a complex relationship between the colonial and decolonial art discussed in the Potosi Principle. Traditionally, the capitalist West serves only to increase and accelerate the world's entropy, demanding ever further enclosure and privatization. One interpretation of the pushback against these powers must also be that where mutation and therefore evolution stands on the side of the global South, one should not forget, with Havel, that mutation is entropy in reverse. The viral infection of political extremism. The actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. Ibram Sholani Kendi. Arguably, the foundational lies to which the rise of violent totalitarian government in the 20th century may be traced are the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This forged text can be said to have underpinned the resurgent wave of anti-Semitism within interwar Europe. It was commissioned by Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 to 1917, the last emperor of Russia, upon the recommendation of Konstantin Pobdeostenev, a political advisor. The quote-unquote protocols were brought into existence in Paris around the year 1900. To me, the manipulation of racial tensions through anti-Jewish pogroms and propaganda as a form of statecraft by Nicholas II does sadly dovetail with the use of racialized propaganda and the dissemination of fabricated information within the Bolshevik model of totalitarian rule developed by Joseph Stalin. This is not to imply that the quote-unquote protocols held the same ideological importance for the Bolsheviks as Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. There are, however, important parallels in the mobilizing effects that these texts unleashed, despite their radically different descriptions of material reality, class oppression, and their concomitant answers to the question of what is to be done. Clearly, a great deal of unpacking is necessary in order to meaningfully discuss what I mean by the terms totalitarian and anti-Semitic. I hope, however, that the reader requires less definition concerning the tragedy of Marxist-Leninist revolutionary Bolshevism, centralized and corrupted under Stalin. As a way to navigate the following histories, it is worth bearing in mind that a red thread can be said to connect these awful narratives. A pattern is apparent. Time and again, state powers have created laws that serve to justify the killings of persons who present any obstacle to power's accumulation. It is therefore possible to read this chapter as an examination of the role and politics of rights and privileges as developed and adapted by colonial and imperial forces such as the British. What is also important to grasp from the very beginning is that the quote-unquote protocols are only worth mentioning because of the way in which the lies contained therein were believed. And this demands an understanding of the work which prepared readers of the protocols to become fervent advocates of its content. The protocols outlined the manner in which the authors perceived Jewish forces to be operative in the world to the greater good of themselves and to the great disenfranchisement of all other groups. Brackets, precisely what the Nazi Party and their sympathisers intended for themselves. Unbrackets. The text was first published in English in 1919 and was exposed as a fabrication by the British newspaper The Times in 1921 and countless others thereafter. The quote-unquote protocols are still in wide circulation today.